I've had to catch my recycle and garbage bins a couple of times as they escaped down the driveway or got flipped over by the wind. So.
Oh wow! Yeah, just check the foundation for ruby slippers once you get out.
Yeah, exactly.
The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your hosts, Gabe Reinick and Ken Holyoke.
Welcome back to the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. I'm Gabe Reinick, and I'm in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and I'm joined, as I am every fortnight, by Ken Holyoke in Lethbridge, Alberta. How are you, Ken?
Very best. It's probably the windiest day that I have experienced in Lethbridge. It is so windy that the over-ear headphones that I have, I can feel the pressure change in the headphones when gusts of wind pick up. And it's one of those days that the water in the toilet is kind of moving back and forth. I've actually had to catch my recycle and garbage bins a couple of times as they escaped down the driveway or got flipped over by the wind. So.
Oh wow! Yeah, just check the foundation for ruby slippers once you get out.
Exactly.
And your semester's over.
The semester's over. I finished grading this morning, actually. So
good.
So grades will be submitted in the next couple days. I won't get an email from the dean because I'm doing it with 3 days grace. So.
Good for you. The Courvoisier always tastes sweetest after the grades are in, doesn't it?
Exactly. It
for
really
you,
does.
not necessarily for the student, but the...
Yeah. How about yourself? Are you all done?
Nope. My final is tomorrow
Nice.
night. But the teaching assistant is handling that, thank goodness.
Excellent.
So I just have to sort of give it the old blessing at the end of term here, which is absolutely the way to do it. So we've got a very exciting episode today, but before we get to that, we are sponsored, as we are every fortnight, by the Association of Professional Archaeologists of New Brunswick and by the University of Lethbridge Shirk Exchange program. So we thank them very much for bringing this podcast to you every fortnight, whether you need it or not, listener. That's right. There's Ken and I are not the only ones to blame here. For this, but Ken, the listener may have noticed that those fine organizations are still sponsoring something called the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. And although we've had a series of really pretty compelling names, we're still looking for a new name for this podcast that just captures the kind of zippy content, the expansive deep dives on New Brunswick archaeology that we provide here. I don't know if it could be an expansive and a deep dive. I guess that's like an open pit mine of knowledge. But that's right. We're doing a mountaintop removal of archaeology knowledge here. We are fracking for archaeology here on the New Brunswick.
Fracking, I think, is all underground. I think you're right. It's an open pit of archaeology.
Yeah. We aren't pumping the water into the mountain. We're chopping the top off.
A virtual tailings pond of information. That's
right. But so Ken, so we like to open up the opportunity really to rename this podcast to our listeners, and if they were to do that, we like to make sure that they would be well compensated for their efforts and for their creativity, because there's one thing we take seriously on this podcast. It's acknowledging the intellectual property of our listeners. So Ken, if the listener had a new name for this podcast, where would they email it?
They would send it to New Brunswick Archaeology, all one word, and that's archaeology spelled ARCHAEOLOGY, New Brunswick Archaeology @gmail.com.
That's right. And if the listener were to send in the winning name, what would they get, Ken?
Well, so Gabe, it's getting to be that golden time of the year. The snow is falling, and then 12 hours later, the sun is out, and it's T-shirt weather. All of the sports are happening, so we just had March Madness. Now baseball's swinging in. Got basketball and hockey playoffs just getting going in the coming days. Archaeology's not different. I think most of our colleagues in CRM just went through their own March Madness. Grading is wrapping up, and students are last class bashing. We've got the SAAs this week, the CAAs in a couple of weeks, and a number of small regional conferences just about every weekend until the field season starts. And Gabe, you're going to the field this summer, right?
I am, yes.
Yes, I am too, and I think it's critical, actually, that before we all go out with shovels, trowels, total stations, and GPSs, before we score that ground or drop those pin flags, we want our colleagues, our students, and our listening audience to be ready for the physical demands of the job. That's why we are offering to the lucky listener who comes up with a new name for our podcast the first ever early access customized New Brunswick Archaeology podcast, or whatever the new name might be, Fieldwork Fitness Regime.
Oh, wow.
So step aside Peloton. This is a workout regimen built on the principles of calisthenics that can be brought with you wherever you go. It will not only get you ready for the ardors of fieldwork, we can ensure that after 30 days of this program, you'll be the envy of your friends and coworkers, sleeping better, and most of all, keenly informed on the history and archaeology of New Brunswick. That's right, listeners. Your co-hosts, Gabe and Ken, will guide you on this video fitness journey.
I worried this might be where this was heading.
Not only showing you how to do the exercises, but instilling you with kernels of information that you can show off, like your bulging biceps. On core day, you might be doing 45 seconds of knee-ups, followed by bicycle crunches, sit-ups, and burpees. But as you work your reps, Gabe's voice will also let you know that sometime after 4000 BP, the Susquehanna presence in the Maine Maritimes brought with it the precursors of Indigenous pottery. And as you tone your upper body through push-ups, dips, and planking, Ken will remind you that despite the lack of archaeological fish remains from the interior, this is likely an artifact of preservation and methodological choices related to screen aperture. So whether you're stomping on a shovel all summer or scraping a trowel, we believe that your performance can only be improved with this workout, reduce your risks of injury, and most of all, waylay the detrimental effects of an increased frequency of amber restoratives. It might be said that the facts are the workout of the brain. So the NB ArcPod 30-day pre-field fitness program will provide you with the benefits from body to mind, and you, lucky listener, will be the first to experience this if you can give us a new name for the New Brunswick Archaeology podcast.
Oh, Ken, I mean, to foreshadow a little bit, the listener's going to be more swole than a moose turning into a horse turning into a human that we're going to learn about later in this episode here.
Exactly.
Well, that is great, Ken, and I think it really speaks to just one of our themes on this podcast, which has been self-care.
Exactly.
Okay, and so Ken, if the lucky listener wants to work out with us over the next 30 days, where would they send that prize-winning name?
That would be sent to our email at newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com. That's New Brunswick Archaeology, all one word, archaeology spelled ARCHAEOLOGY, newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com.
That's right. And Ken, is it just our glutes that are bulging, or is our mailbag also bulging if we look at that email?
Well, so I think that this might be a rest day. So we had a pretty heavy leg day last time we were on the fortnight ago, and the mailbag is looking a little thin. It's looking like how thin our listeners will look after this 30-day fitness program. But we always welcome new mail. And so, listener, if you have any questions about the podcast, if you have suggestions for future episodes, if you have a couple of clever ideas for a podcast name, we always welcome emails to our mailbag.
That's right. And Ken, am I right that the next time we talk to the listener, we will also be able to accept handwritten notes in the Paris of the Prairie? Is Saskatoon the Paris of the Prairie?
I don't think so. I think Bragdon is the Paris of the Prairie, isn't it?
Oh, boy, that would be Bragdon, Manitoba never fails to impress. But I think I only actually know that song from or know that line from the Tragically Hip song. But well, let's pretend that it's going to be. We will see them soon in the Stockholm of the Prairie.
You're right. Saskatoon is considered the Paris of the Prairies.
That's great. And so we'll be there, and we unfortunately have not gotten our New Brunswick Archaeology, is it a bunny snuggler?
Bunny hug.
Bunny hug, right. I think bunny snuggler is better, but which I understand is what a hooded sweatshirt is called in Saskatoon?
That's right, and we don't have our NB ArcPod branded gotch, which is Saskatoon lingo for underwear.
Oh, speak for yourself, Ken. But we will have stickers and fridge magnets.
We will have and coasters.
And coasters.
There's going to be all sorts of elegant swag at the CAAs, and so
don't let there be a
on the lookout for
Courvoisier
us.
ring on your bedside table or dining room table or wherever you drink your Courvoisier.
Yeah, we'll be the ones in the Visvest colored shirts that say podcaster on them. I think is the goal, isn't it?
Yeah. You'll know us when you see us, listener, and you'll also know us when you hear us. And we'll be looking to interview folks about their presentations. So please, if you are a listener and even especially really if we haven't met you, we'd love if you stop by and said hi. I think we're going to have a table in the book room. Ken, is that right?
I think that is the goal. Yeah, we got to get the paperwork done on that. But
okay, no
I
promises.
think that we will have a presence there.
Yes, we will, and we'll be accepting presents too: bottles of Balvenie Scotch, drink tickets for the various pub crawls, and so on. So we're looking forward, listener, to seeing you there in Saskatoon, which is the last province I haven't been to, Ken.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a great achievement.
Yep. After that, it's just the territories left for me.
Yeah, I'm just the territories now. So
good for
I
you.
experienced Manitoba as I drove out here actually last summer or two summers ago.
That's fantastic. So we've got a special episode today, Ken.
Yeah, we've got a really exciting guest on. Bryn Tapper, who's a PhD candidate at Memorial University of Newfoundland, is coming on to join us and talk about rock art in the Maritimes, which is a pretty fascinating topic. So we look forward to. We're going to jump back in time here as the whoosh proceeds, and listener, you'll be treated to a really interesting interview with Bryn.
That's right, and also the whoosh proceeds is the name of Kem's memoir that he's working on. I think is the.
And we'll catch up with you after the interview, listener, for our most recent hit pieces.
All right, talk to you soon, listener.
All right, and we are joined tonight, or this afternoon, I guess, for everybody, by Bryn Tapper, who's joining us from Happy Valley Goose Bay, Labrador. Bryn is a PhD candidate at the Memorial University of Newfoundland, whose research focuses on the contents and contexts of rock art in the Canadian Maritimes in order to discuss its role in Indigenous societies in the past. Originally from Cornwall, United Kingdom, he started his archaeological career in cultural resource management and worked for the Historic Environment Service of Cornwall Council for over a decade until 2012. For his current project, he uses a combination of formal archaeological techniques, so survey, computational photography, and GIS analysis, combined with ethnohistorical and ethnographic data to investigate petroglyph sites in order to articulate the different functional and ideological levels at which these phenomena operated. Bryn has published in the Canadian Journal of Archaeology, the World Archaeology, Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory, and most recently Time and Mind, the Journal of Archaeology, Consciousness and Culture, with a forthcoming co-authored chapter in Northeast Anthropology. So welcome to the show, Bryn. Thank you for coming on.
Hi, Ken. Hi, Gabe.
Thanks for coming on, Bryn.
Thanks for inviting me today.
So tonight we're gonna be talking about rock art, Bryn, and I think we wondered if you could start off just by telling us what is rock art.
Okay, yeah. So basically, in this part of the world, we're talking about carvings and paintings. So these are basically images, usually, but some can sometimes include inscriptions that are carved onto cliff faces, either vertical cliff faces or horizontal bedrock outcrops, or in the Canadian Shield, a bit further north from where we are now. Paintings usually made using red ochre with some form of binder, which are applied to usually cliff faces, and which are sometimes, usually preserved by some kind of mineral precipitate or deposit that kind of seals those paintings for posterity, if you like. So we're really talking about carvings that have been in the Maritimes. We're talking about carvings that have been made during the pre-contact periods using lithics, hammerstones, perhaps to peck or kind of make images in rock surfaces, and after contact, quite often using metal tools, nails, chisels, things like that.
It's excellent. And so you talked about paintings, which the listener will know will refer to pictographs, basically, and then the rock etchings, which are petroglyphs. And so Are there any sort of challenges to preservation for each of them? You mentioned that at least the petroglyphs that you found, or the paintings, sorry, the pictographs that you found have been preserved through some kind of weathering process, basically. But what other challenges are there to the preservation of some of these things? So how hard are they to find, basically?
Yeah, needle and haystacks in this part of the world, actually. To give you a sense, there are maybe 12 pictograph sites in the whole of Quebec and Maine, in eastern Canada, basically, Quebec kind of eastwards. And that compares to, at least 400 pictograph sites in northern Ontario, Manitoba, and across to northern Saskatchewan. So really, when we talk about rock art in eastern Canada and Quebec and in the Maritimes, we're talking about a handful of sites, kind of relatively. So finding them, is usually by luck, by chance. In the Maritimes, we're talking maybe 16 petroglyph sites at most in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So really, very few. The only pictograph sites are found in southwest Maine, and they probably represent outliers again of these pictograph traditions that you find on the Great Lakes and in the Canadian Shield. So the kind of issues affecting their preservation of pictographs is weathering. So unless these paintings are actually sealed in some way, they're going to easily kind of erode or wash away just through being exposed, to environmental conditions. In terms of petroglyphs, these, in their very nature, being carved into bedrock, they do survive and can survive very well. There are petroglyphs from southern coastal eastern Maine at Machias Bay, for example, that mark Hedden, kind of dates to perhaps the late Archaic, probably even likely, I would say, the early woodland period. So these can, survive over, at least 3,000 years or, of course, longer. The kind of pressures that are the forces to change, or the kind of the pressures that can degrade petroglyphs. Obviously, weathering. A lot of sites are located on the edge of water bodies. So those sites at Machias Bay, there's one site in French Lake on the Oromocto River in New Brunswick, which are on the shoreline. And so ice rafting, continual kind of rising and lowering of water levels can obviously begin to deteriorate and degrade petroglyphs. I think one of the things that may explain, although this I haven't really can't really prove this, the kind of paucity of petroglyph sites in the Maritimes, is that unlike the Shield, there isn't a profusion, if you like, of cliff faces or those kind of topographies which would be natural canvases, if you like,
right,
on which to carve. And of course, following contact, the huge lumbering kind of operations, that involve blasting away falls or cataracts, or those kind of locales that might have impeded, say, log drives on rivers, for example, may also have kind of destroyed some sites. What you find is that in terms of their distribution, a lot of rock art sites are found at kind of unusual or kind of liminal places in the landscape, places which have somehow in some way, slightly more unusual than other places. So waterfalls and cataracts, if you like, are shown elsewhere to be places that have attracted rock art in the past.
No, that's good. And so, actually, where would you find these places is kind of one of the questions that we had. But also, and that's interesting that you talk about some of these places maybe being destroyed just through industrial development and that sort of thing in the last couple hundred years. And do you get a sense from like oral history or legends and stories like of places that you have a pretty good sense may have been impacted by post-contact developments and that kind of thing, that you suspect there probably were art sites there that maybe aren't there anymore?
Simply no. No, I don't get that sense. But the good example that I can give comes from southwest Nova Scotia, and it's called McGowan Lake. It's right next to Kejimkujik Lake, and these sites have the greatest concentration of post-contact petroglyphs anywhere in the Maritimes and in eastern Canada. Actually, there's probably in the region of about 1,000 images that can be ascribed to Indigenous authorship at both of these lakes. Now, McGowan Lake, the site there was actually flooded as part of dam operations in the 1940s. And so the petroglyphs at that site, about 150 or so, are now permanently submerged. In terms of, I mean, I said no, but in terms of the kind of oral histories and the kind of traditions of Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik people, there are references to what are called effigy rocks. Now, these are kind of unusual rocks that may resemble, kind of human figures or faces, or maybe called grandmother or grandfather rocks. And there is a coincidence, between these and imagery elsewhere in the Canadian Shield, where sometimes there are, for example, French ethno-historical accounts of traveling up the Ottawa River and seeing the famous site of Rocher-l'Oiseau, which was kind of respected as a kind of another than human being, or like a person, and venerated with gifts by passing kind of travelers. And that site actually has pictographs associated, or at the site. Now, there are numerous similar kind of effigy rocks and grandfather and grandmother rocks in Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick. But there's only one that I've found that actually coincides with a petroglyph, and this is called Boundary Rock in southwest Nova Scotia. And the petroglyph that's actually on it is actually a late 19th century ideogram, a Mi'kmaq hieroglyphic ideogram. So that's the only example I can give concretely between these kind of effigy places, these salient places, and making of petroglyphs.
The discerning listener will have heard Ken heard the phrase "other than human persons," and there was a big a relational ontology alarm that went in, and he actually had to be restrained by his psychiatrist, who's standing there in immediate post-dissertation haze. But could you explain what an ideogram is for the listener, Bryn?
Yeah, basically, it's a character used in Mi'kmaq Catholicism. In the late 17th century, a Recollect Franciscan missionary called Chrétien Leclerc observed. He was based up in northern New Brunswick, and he resided with Mi'kmaq in that part of the world. And he noticed, and he makes a record of this, of Mi'kmaq people, Mi'kmaq kids, actually drawing kind of pictography, imagery on birch bark. And he's interested in converting Mi'kmaq people to Catholicism. And so he saw this kind of, this Indigenous pictography, this interest in image making, and he saw it as a way to actually try to convert Mi'kmaq to Catholicism. So he developed what are known as the Mi'kmaq hieroglyphs. And basically they are symbols used to teach catechism and prayer. And they are basically like a shorthand to kind of teach this to Mi'kmaq. And so it took about 50 years. By about the end of the first quarter of the 18th century, this use of hieroglyphics had spread throughout Mi'kma'ki very quickly, very rapidly, which I think maybe speaks to a kind of a familiarity among Mi'kmaq people and others in the region with pictography in various ways and in various media. So basically, these are symbols which basically enable prayers to be translated, if you like, for use by Mi'kmaq people.
So you picked up on something there that I was kind of curious about, and that's that rock art in different media, and in particular whether like mobiliary or portable art is something that you've looked at. And so these are like objects basically that you might carry with you. So figures or carvings and that kind of thing. If that kind of classifies as rock art, or if you would separate that out sort of from a broader rock art class.
I don't make a distinction between the two in terms of their kind of content. I see the rock art and kind of incised objects, whether that's, kind of incised pebbles or stones, whether it's, decorations on ceramics, geometric decorations on ceramics, or the kind of geometric decorations you see in early quill work or in moose hair embroidery, or, kind of the geometric or figurative art that early French ethno-historians record on wigwam, on clothing, on, sails of shallops. I see these as part of a kind of a broader kind of pictographic kind of tradition. And I see kind of stylistic similarities, between, these kind of the imagery you find in these different media in both pre-contact and post-contact contexts.
So you mentioned the sort of syncretic decorations between Catholic symbols on Mi'kmaq petroglyphs. So that gives us sort of a recent date on some of this stuff. But I couldn't help but notice, as you're saying, geometric decorations. I mean, my mind immediately went to the Maritime Archaic, right, where you've got these sort of incised decorative things. And so I guess I'm just sort of curious, what are the kind of a two-part question, really? What are the earliest evidence that exists for the kind of petroglyph motifs or pictograph motifs you're talking about? And then how do you actually know, right? Because it's really hard to direct date, I suppose, a petroglyph. You can't really. So I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, it's very difficult to date petroglyphs. We don't have the kind of varnishes that preserve and that can be dated up here in the northeast like we do perhaps in the southeast part of the continent. In terms of kind of chronologies, if you like, really it seems to me that it's really in the kind of late Maritime Archaic where you begin to see these geometric motifs on, say, for example, the swordfish rostrum at places like the Nevin site, or the incised slate bayonets and points at places like Cow Point, where that seems to be really where this kind of interest in kind of geometrical representational imagery really begins to kind of become archaeologically visible, to my mind. It's always struck me that the kind of the interest in the kind of geometric forms that you see in this late archaic kind of context. To my mind, I do see some of that interest in symmetry, reflection, the kind of that use of zigzags, chevrons, herringbones, curvilinear elements, things like that. I see that in ceramics. And then later on, coming towards, I guess, in the post-contact period, I see that in quill work. That interest in this kind of geometric forms, and playing with those kind of arrangements. In terms of petroglyphs themselves, Mark Hedden, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning of the interview here, he draws stylistic analogies with petroglyph traditions further west and to the south to suggest that the imagery at Machias Bay, for example, is influenced by, perhaps he suggests, maybe Edina kind of cultural influences coming in from the west, and maybe from the southern Great Lakes too. So his work really, from my point of view, kind of provides a kind of a benchmark for kind of analysis of pre-contact imagery in the Canadian on the Maritime Peninsula and for the Canadian Maritimes, because he identifies at least 6 styles and and a number of kind of sub-styles, if you like, kind of basically extending over a period of 3 millennia. So really, we're looking at imagery and the rock art traditions that really begin certainly by the early woodland, but also extend actually into the first quarter of the 20th century.
That's great. And Machias, Mark Hedden had the advantage too of using relative sea level, I think, right, to try to estimate some dates on those. Yeah, I worked at Machias actually years ago, which was a lot of fun. And dug a unit with Mark Hedden, which was very cool. You know, sort of one of these things that you don't appreciate as much at the time as you do later, I suppose. So I've been enjoying reading your work.
I've never been there, and I'd love to go. It's on my bucket list.
Oh, extraordinary. I mean, maybe next time we do a field school fairly near to there, actually. And so next time we're out, we typically do a tour with Donald Sochtoma. So maybe next time we'll have to get you out there so you can take a look. It'd be cool.
Yeah.
So Mark Hedden also associated the Machias petroglyphs with shamanism, right? And in your work, you talk about how these are very, or you were just mentioning how these petroglyphs tend to be at very kind of interesting places, and
you mentioned liminal places too,
yes.
like yeah.
What's your sort of take on what people are doing? Why are they making these? Ken is looking at me, and Bryn is too. We talked before, but we weren't going to get too much in the weeds on theory here. But I think I've just,
we're setting you loose. That's
it's like the Pentecostal revival preacher who's promised he's just bringing the box of snakes just in case. We're not actually going to pass those around, but they're here if we need them.
Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, I think rock art sites do many things. I think they are sacred places, some sites, and I think I agree with Mark Hedden's interpretations of much of the rock art, pre-contact rock art at Machias Bay being concerned with vision questing of ritual specialists. So essentially, his 6 styles over this, very long period, he basically charts what he sees or he interprets as the changing role of the ritual specialist, the shaman, over time. He argues that these petroglyph sites are concerned with the vision questing kind of rituals of shaman, and their attempts to acquire spiritual power for various reasons, whether that's for healing, for hunting success, for divination, for basically kind of use in warfare, or to use against other groups. So he suggests that the change in styles kind of reflect also the changing role of the ritual specialist, of the shaman over time, and that what starts off as a very kind of maybe private kind of experience concerned with private vision questing in, if you like, the first few 2 or 3 styles, morphs by perhaps the middle woodland and certainly by the late woodland period into a much more kind of public and overt demonstration of the shaman's kind of power and relevance to the community. And the only rock art, the pre-contact rock art site that I consider to be in the Maritimes at French Lake on the Oromocto River, I think belongs to this tradition down that kind of evident at Machias Bay. I think the French Lake site is a satellite, basically, of what's going on down there. And one of the ways he kind of says that the petroglyphs show this kind of increasingly public and kind of demonstrative role of the shaman is that the figures, the anthropomorphic figures, the human figures that are kind of he uses to kind of track the change in the role become much more kind of animated. They start off as fairly kind of abstract and fairly kind of inanimate, and they become increasingly kind of animate in the sense that you start getting figures with, bent arms, bent at the elbows, which is kind of a widespread Algonquian kind of motif, kind of suggesting kind of the acquisition of spiritual power or the supplication or respect, showing to spiritual beings or powerful spiritual beings for acquiring that power. You get unidirectional feet. You get kind of a whole number of kind of motifs, surrounding these human figures, which kind of really, he says, alludes to the need of these ritual specialists to kind of demonstrate the efficacy of their position in society. And the French Lake site, I think, belongs to the later part of that tradition, probably in the later part of the late woodland. It shows a human figure with their arms bent at the elbows. They've got unidirectional feet. They might have a slightly pointed, maybe beak-like protuberance on their head. And this figure is associated with a beaver, and what I interpret as two white-tailed deer, zoomorphs, and its location on the shoreline, I think is interesting. So I kind of mentioned earlier this deliberate placement, kind of what's maybe in what I understand in Algonquian cosmologies reflects a kind of a meeting point or kind of an axis where the water, the earth, or rock and kind of sky meet. And this kind of junction is important because there are different beings who live in these water, the underworld, or in the rock in the underworld, or on earth, the plane of, people, if you like, or beings that inhabit the upper world of the sky. And where these different kind of realms meet, I think are often deliberately chosen as places for placing rock art, because I think there are persuasive arguments for suggesting that the placement of rock art at these kind of places is deliberately designed because this rock art is meant to be kind of, if you like, read or received by some of these, non-human powerful beings.
This sort of passing between different worlds concept, basically, right? Like, yeah, I think this is a separate conversation other than the podcast, but I've had thoughts about this for like the quarry at Washtenamock Lake, where it's right on the water, and sort of this is a place where you're going to pull up your canoe, and sort of disembarking from a canoe is passing between worlds, and that kind of idea, and that these same sorts of things are going on by these depiction of artwork. So that's really fascinating. So I wanted to pick up on something where you talked about the transition from a very personal kind of vision questing style of to a more group oriented or public use of these rock art sites. And in particular, I'm kind of interested, I wanted to talk about Passamaquoddy, the rock art cluster there. And my understanding, and I've never actually visited the site itself, but I understand sort of the concentration of it. And is the thinking that this is one of these places where people were coming together to witness this sort of like the artwork itself, or is it somebody within society? Do you think was probably like maybe one of these ritual specialists or shamans going out there, kind of negotiating change going on? Because most of these are post-contact petroglyphs, and so I guess generally the short question is, what do you think is going on at Keji, and why is there so much in that particular place?
Well, the first thing I would say is I don't consider Kedjimkujik or McGowan Lakes to be the same kind of rock art site as Machias Bay. I don't think the imagery at Kedjimkujik is shamanic in that sense. There are certainly shamanistic elements, i.e. people are still, holding on to kind of spiritual beliefs and kind of their ways of understanding on being in the world, their philosophies, if you like, as they're negotiating, this new post-contact world of, contact, settler colonialism, religious conversion and things like this. So I think at Kedjimkujik, what we see is really a tradition that appears to mainly reflect Mi'kmaq life in the 18th and 19th centuries. The majority of the imagery there, I would suggest, reflects basically the indigenous, the Mi'kmaq side of post-contact experiences and the ways in which Mi'kmaq adapted to the challenges around them.
So it's much more like conventional artwork than the styles at Machias, maybe?
Yeah. So one of the things that is evident is that the imagery at Kejimkujik is incised. I haven't seen any examples of pecked imagery at Kejimkujik which would match the style or the content that you see at Machias or French Lake. There are images which Garrick Mallory, when he visited the site in 1887 and 1888, interpreted as shaking tents, or the ground plans of shaking tents. Myers in the 70s, when he looked at it, he picked up on this French term jugglers tents, basically kind of placing them in the context of shamanic shaken tent traditions. And Mallory said that when he spoke to some of the Mi'kmaq people he met there, that they remembered some of these kind of ceremonies going on. So I'm not saying that it doesn't exist there, but broadly, the majority of the imagery doesn't seem to be concerned with kind of necessarily the esoteric private kind of ceremony or vision questing of shaman. It seems to me that it's actually a kind of a much broader canvas done by all members of the community, and depicting, the trials and the travails of, their experiences. The concentration of petroglyphs at Kejimkujik, I think, can be explained. There's archaeological evidence for human occupation and activity on the lake over the last 4 millennia. It's an important place for spring and fall fishing in the late woodland period. There are eel weirs on the lake, but as I mentioned, as far as I can tell, I haven't seen any evidence of pre-contact imagery there. Now that it may have eroded away. Some archaeologists think that maybe the imagery there does appear to weather and erode particularly quickly. But I can't help thinking that I think that the geology at Kejimkujik and say at Machias Bay both metamorphosed sedimentary rocks. I do wonder why the imagery on the experiencing the ravages of the huge tidal ranges of the Bear Fundy is surviving over 3 millennia, but imagery on interior Kejimkujik Lake isn't. So I at the moment I'm not persuaded that there is a pre-contact tradition there. What it seems to me is that what you get at Kejimkujik, and Brian Molyneux kind of identified some petroglyphs there of what he interpreted as 2 17th century sailing vessels. And you get similar kind of vessels identified by Hedden in Machias Bay, and another site where he identified a Basque shallop on Washington County on the coast of Maine. So I think you do get kind of what are perhaps the first or some of the earliest European experiences of European contact being recorded at Kejimkujik. And I do wonder whether, given kind of Mi'kmaq seasonal rounds, whether this is Mi'kmaq who've gone to the coast to begin the fur trade or to trade with European vessels visiting in summer months, and then are retreating into the interior for either fall and winter kind of hunt for fur-bearing species. And at that point, they're kind of recording experiences, of their experiences on the coast in the summer.
So it's sort of like the Tarantines recording their record of that sort of intermediary road out on the roll out on the Bay of Fundy, eh?
Yeah, potentially, for sure. I mean, I think Mark Hedden's site on the site he identifies in Washington County, which has got a Basque shallop and a sail on it, is particularly intriguing. And when I look at that, I think exactly this kind of idea of Tarantines and Mi'kmaq controlling in the early, kind of decade or decades of the trade, kind of controlling it on the indigenous side. I think, coming back to Kejimkujik and McGowan Lake, I think certainly by the last quarter of the 18th century, I think with the flood of loyalists and immigrants into the Canadian Maritimes, I think that puts huge stresses on the Mi'kmaq in terms of their of pursuing their traditional seasonal rounds and the territories and resources that they can access. And it seems to me that coastal and riverine kind of places are equally attractive to immigrants who kind of settle and kind of take up these grounds. And I think what that means is you get a gradual shifting of the Mi'kmaq themselves, kind of retreat in a way to the interior or to those grounds where they can still prosecute and live their ways of life. And I think really the profusion of imagery from the 18th and 19th century reflects the fact that, to my mind, the Mi'kmaq world is kind of being squeezed in a way. And I think, what you're getting at Kejimkujik is basically a document and a kind of record from the Mi'kmaq side of some of these kind of historical processes. And maybe I can give an example. So Mark Hedden notes that around contact, and certainly in the century or so after contact, that the kind of zoomorphs found at Machias Bay basically changed from deer-like forms to moose-like forms. And actually, moose-like forms are the most common form you find at Kejimkujik. You do find caribou and a handful of deer, but really, moose are the dominant zoomorphic form. And stylistically, some of these can be placed in the 18th century, I think. But what happens is from my understanding of the kind of settler colonialism, is that by the beginning of the 19th century, and this is when really kind of the interior of southwest Nova Scotia really begins to be opened up, and you get kind of intensive settlement by people coming in from the south shore of southwest Nova Scotia in particular. You get a shift, or rather, you suddenly petroglyphs showing Mi'kmaq in canoes shooting porpoise actually start to appear in the imagery, and I think this could be interpreted in a way that the shift from, say, moose to, say, porpoise is that there are a lot of accounts which suggest that game, caribou, moose, were really becoming quite scarce as settlers really began to kind of hunt and exploit these resources as well. And one way that the Mi'kmaq adapted was to then actually pursue the porpoise hunt. And this begins in the early 19th century and carries through much of the 19th century. So to my mind, the imagery really is documenting the various ways in which Mi'kmaq kind of have to adapt their kind of economic kind of strategies in order to cope with kind of changing realities.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm reminded a little bit. We had last fortnight on. We had Chris Wolf on, who was talking about the archaeology of fear and kind of the different ways in which you can think about fear as a sort of universal human experience that you need to mediate in various kinds of ways. And it almost sounds as if kind of a through thread between that episode and this episode may be that we're learning a lot about the ways people, either in the archaeological record or through the petroglyphs, are kind of recording their own experiences of those very human responses, whatever we might call them. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like a written record of negotiating these changes and how to unpackage them and rework them, basically. Yeah.
Still bet that Basque shallop, though. I think having spent some time in Washington County, Maine, that's the equivalent of when you go to the bar and there's the picture behind the till saying not to, under any circumstances, take a check from this person. I think that's probably a reminder that the guy in that Basque shallop shouldn't be trusted. You wanna deal only with somebody else, I think. So we talked a little bit about. And you actually just told a lot of the kinds of stories that we see in these petroglyphs, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the audience for them. So is the audience for these petroglyphs the communities that are making them? Is it people who come from away and aren't familiar with those places? Is it a signal to Europeans about this place? It's sort of all of the above. Am I getting at this in the wrong way? I'm curious what the audience is for these. Or is it posterity? Is it the future?
Yeah. Okay, so it seems to me that the placement of this imagery on, for example, Machias, on the shoreline, on bedrock, people are passing that all the time. They're going to see it. Whether they're actually directly involved in some of those experiences or rituals is a different question. But I think, at Machias Bay, people passing and living in that bay are going to see it. People at French Lake, there's archaic and woodland period kind of evidence for occupations during those periods. At Kejimkujik Lake, it's located on the waterway and the portage route linking the Bay of Fundy with the Atlantic South Shore. People are going to pass it. You come down through the Mersey, you're going to pass these outcrops. So I do think that they are placed in situations where they can be experienced by the public, if you like.
Would they have been read like almost like a codex or a record of like a historical record, or would it be recognized as something different? And it's probably situational depending upon who's looking at it. My sense is that there may be two things kind of going on here. Is that some of that imagery produced, say, for example, at Machias Bay, I think does speak to a kind of an esoteric kind of code, if you like, which is probably only really intelligible to other ritual practitioners. Having said that, in terms of actually signs that can be interpreted, having said that, I think this imagery does act at kind of an indexical level as well, in the sense that people know the kind of practices that may have taken place there. They may not have been conversed in the precise imagery, the esoteric imagery of it, but they would know that these are, salient places, they are potentially sacred places, and that the activities, of ritual specialists at these sites themselves become signs of kind of significance or importance, even if the particular coding may be unknown. I think at places like Kejimkujik, because a lot of the imagery does seem to kind of reflect kind of quotidian life, I think a lot of it is kind of perhaps more easily or more widely read. It strikes me that, for example, Roman Catholic imagery at Kejimkujik, like altarpieces, crosses, ideograms, and things like this. But what I was struck by when I was looking at this is that, as I mentioned, how quickly, for example, ideograms kind of spread throughout Mi'kma'ki, but also the fact that they weren't simply used for religious purposes and religious instruction. There are a number of examples where ideograms are mixed with kind of other motifs and used in non-rehearsed kind of, if you like, secular kind of instances to convey messages about, someone's travel route or hunting experiences and things like this. So my sense is that there is a kind of a pictographic literacy, if you like, at a kind of a societal level. But whether some imagery is maybe more esoteric than others, I think maybe that could be a case. And it might, as I mentioned, it might act as for those who are versed in it, as a kind of as a sign. But for those who aren't versed in it, it may act as an index to kind of particular kind of behaviours that are more or less appropriate to do at a site, for example. I mean, I'm reminded of Bragdon's kind of analogy in southern New England, where she talks about a kind of a widespread kind of literacy, if you like, of kind of shamanic signs and things like that. That was then replaced by
kind of I guess a religious, or literary and kind of religious text. It's kind of quite, that kind of converted. And I see a similar kind of thing going on in the Maritimes with kind of this kind of, widespread use of pictography in various guises, and this rapid kind of pickup of Mi'kmaq hieroglyphs, and then later Mi'kmaq kind of a hybrid Mi'kmaq kind of Latin kind of text too. So I can't remember if I answered your question.
Yes, yeah, no, that's good. So
I think you did.
Yeah, so I'm going to hold my question about Persian semiotics for a future episode, but
Ken, our listener loves Persian semiotics. It's,
scaling out a little bit and kind of just putting this in a very.
Ken, do you also have money on the Persian semiotics fight? Is that the?
Yeah, we're starting the NB Pod sports gambling fund here. So, but how when you go out to assess rock art, what are the tools that you're using? How do you identify it? When you're recording it, are there different sort of techniques that you're going to be using? Essentially, what are kind of the methods of a rock art archaeologist, and some of the ways that you approach rock art and the way that you engage with it to, number one, record it, but number two, ensure that you're not damaging it and that you preserve it, that kind of thing?
Yeah, for sure. So I quite like my gadgets. So what I have used are three techniques that are basically computational photography and 3D structured light scanning. So when I first started out, I used close-range photogrammetry, which basically involves taking lots of overlapping images of the surface, of the rock surface with the imagery on it, and then using clever softwares to basically convert that into a 3D model, and which you can then get kind of metric data from to kind of do measurements of, kind of imagery and things like that. All of these techniques are non-invasive. So really it's just me setting up my camera on a tripod with rubber feet, on the rock outcrops, and then just simply photographing them. Photogrammetry is one technique that I've used, but it's kind of a lot of the imagery that I'm looking at, particularly in Nova Scotia, is so finely incised that actually even close range photogrammetry has a tricky time picking up a lot of the detail. I also use something called highlight reflectance transformation imaging, HRTI. And basically, this is another photographic technique. And what it involves is basically setting the camera up over the image to be photographed, and then lighting that image from various different directions and angles. So if you can imagine kind of an imaginary clock around the image, I take photographs, 3 photographs at every 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and so forth around the clock, and I take photographs at various different angles, an acute angle like at 45 degrees, and then maybe a steeper angle. And when I light the image and take a photograph at the same time, this produces maybe anywhere between 40 and 60 images of the same subject. The camera hasn't moved, only the light direction has moved. And what you can do is you can use software to then basically amalgamate all those images into a single kind of image that you can relight on screen using highlights and shadows to pick up the finer details of the incisions.
Yeah, you can do the same thing with lithics to see all the flake scars and that kind of stuff, eh?
Yes. Okay. So that has been a revelation for me. That's been extraordinarily useful for actually picking up detail that previous researchers have missed, or actually identifying new images altogether. But it's a qualitative technique. I can't actually get any metrics off that. So in the last few years, 2-3 years, I've actually been using a 3D structured light scanner, which has been terrific. So really that's how to simplify that. It's basically a scanner which can basically model the 3D, in 3D, the surface of the rock outcrop. And you can get very, very high resolution. So I've been able to get 0.25 of a millimeter resolution on some of the imagery which I'm looking at using this technique. And it's been particularly useful because I can actually begin to kind of get a sense of some of the manufactured techniques used to actually create some of this imagery. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example if you like. I don't know if you know the Quebec site in Bedford, just outside of Halifax. There's a site there which comprises two petroglyphs. One's a large disc of an large round petroglyph of an 8-pointed star or sun motif. It's a design called gagwed in Mi'kmaq, quill work, meaning starfish, and you see it a lot in birch bark quill work produced for the European market from the late 18th century onward. And next to it is another motif of a kind of an anthropomorphic-like figure linked to a vulva motif. Now, when these were first analysed back in the early 80s, they were thought to have been braided and pounded using lithics to actually create them. But the 3D laser scanner, when I looked more closely at these, and with the benefit actually of a molding exercise that Parks Canada had also done on these, it became evident that you can see basically a series of striations, indentations along the base of grooves of these channels forming the petroglyph. And to my mind, they resemble the kind of indentations that you might get if you were striking a cold chisel along the line.
Oh, interesting.
And that obviously that changes the whole kind of historical context for these petroglyphs from being what were thought to be pre-contact imagery to actually being post-contact imagery. Mm-hmm. So that's one way in which kind of using some of this technology has really kind of changed, my thinking and understanding of perhaps the chronology of select images.
It's great. And I think, Bryn, that some of that imagery is illustrated in one of your papers, which we'll drop in the show notes as well for the listener to check out.
Just out of curiosity, is it a Leo that you're using, or what's the tool? Maybe we can get a sponsor here or something. The Leo is this. It's one of these handheld scanners that it kind of looks like a Star Trek phaser almost, and but it's I used one at U of T for they use it for scanning like stela and stuff like that in Doric columns. We actually have one at Lethbridge, and I'm curious about how precise that kind of thing is, but I'm guessing that's not the tool that you use.
Yeah, Ken's not even interested unless you need lead underwear these days. It's
yeah, it's NextScan Pro.
Okay.
Who produces XScan? I can't remember now off the top of my head, but it's basically a wand, that the kind of, like you say, a Star Trek like tool, which I link to a laptop and basically kind of scan back and forth. You can cover maybe, comfortably at a high resolution, maybe a meter square, something like that. XScan Pro is called. So who?
Well, don't worry. We're sure they'll be on the sponsor next episode. That'll.
Sorry, it's Shining 3D Einscan.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes a.
Okay.
Do you have anything else, Gabe? We're cognizant of the time. Like that's the other thing too. Is I feel like we could probably meander off in a bunch of different directions. And did you have any other questions you wanted to ask, Gabe?
I think just before we get to the last question here, mindful of everyone's Courvoisier status, the Machias Bay petroglyphs have sites sort of associated with them. Terrestrial archaeological sites with some evidence for ritual activity. Are there terrestrial, sites, landward sites associated with these other petroglyph sites that have been worked at? Or do we know what sort of activities from the archaeological record are going on in proximity to these petroglyph sites?
The archaeological record at Kejimkujik Lake is pretty sparse for actually the 17th and 18th centuries. But at McGowan Lake, just like 10 miles away, and I kind of see these two as kind of part of the same tradition, evidence for like habitation. So there's a late woodland component there, and there are late woodland occupation sites on Keji too. And then also at McGowan Lake, there's evidence for actually 17th century trade beads and kind of goods kind of coming in, European goods coming in. But I haven't come across any evidence which is kind of identify whether there are kind of ritual enclosures or structures kind of being built or used in that sense. The closest that I've really seen, I think, is the evidence produced by Brian Robinson and Sky Heller in 2017, which I thought was quite interesting, down at Holmes Point in the back of Machias Bay there. And they digging in I think if I'm right in remembering this, what a late woodland context for shell midden, and they found what they thought was a kind of maybe potentially a ritual structure. And then I think maybe associated with that, they found a concentration of sea mink cranial and facial kind of bones, which they pondered whether may have belonged to a shaman's medicine bag, something like that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But to be honest, Gabe, no, in the post-contact record, I haven't seen any evidence of kind of, adjacent sites which really give you a sense of the kind of activities that are going on. At Kejimkujik Lake, a number of Mi'kmaq reserves were established in 1842 and 1843 around the lake, and there is a spatial coincidence between the concentrations of petroglyphs and these Mi'kmaq grants, and what the Mi'kmaq were being encouraged to do at that time was to adopt farming, build frame timber buildings, basically kind of come civilized and undertake farming. Now, my sense is that that particular kind of experience there didn't go very well. There was an epidemic in the late 1840s, which unfortunately meant that a lot of Mi'kmaq families lost their loved ones. And I don't, farming didn't seem to kind of really take off there. But what's interesting is that a lot of the Mi'kmaq names, the inscriptions of Mi'kmaq names who would that you find in the imagery, certainly in the last couple of decades of the 19th century, belong to people who were acted as guides for European and American kind of hunters who sought to use kind of southwest Nova Scotia as their kind of playground, basically for hunting and fishing. And so a lot of these names are, I'm assuming, to be the descendants of some of those families who were granted some of those lots in the early 1840s, and whose kids went on to live and work in that area up until the early decades of the 20th century.
Well, that's great.
Very interesting.
Thanks for that, Bryn. That's interesting.
And I guess the last question I had, and I should have asked this earlier actually when we were talking about what these sites sort of look like. I'm kind of fascinated by Australian rock art and some of the different depictions, and how you can have these sort of stacked images and these X-ray style drawings where you're seeing sort of like and do you get that kind of that style of rock art at all? Do you see anything like that where there might be previous images kind of stacked, like as you're looking through some of these pictographs or even at the petroglyphs, that you can see that they're repeatedly used, basically maybe one particular location that's sort of written over a couple of times, or is it kind of over a larger area and there's not as much reuse of a specific tableau, I guess?
Yeah, no, there are an awful lot of palimpsests, so this kind of basically reusing the same rock surface over time. It strikes me that a lot of these, again, I'll go back to Kejimkujik and McGowan Lakes just because of the sheer number of imagery there. But yes, there's layering of imagery at those sites. It seems that it's one thing I'd like to kind of pursue in future, is this kind of relationship between kind of the Mi'kmaq petroglyphs and inscriptions, and then later settler inscriptions, which kind of are often laid over the Mi'kmaq ones. And there are awful lot of dates associated with that. So, you can begin to get a sense of some relative chronologies in some places. In terms of actually imagery being reused, yeah, there are some quite interesting examples again at Kejimkujik and McGowan Lakes, and particularly I'm thinking of one which Brian Molyneux kind of wrote about in the 1980s, which was basically several ranks of moose kind of exhibiting behaviours associated with the kind of the autumnal rut are kind of found at McGowan Lake, and one of these was actually turned into a new scene. It was turned into a horse with a female rider with another kind of male figure and two small kind of children kind of nearby. So, and the one of the figures is holding a cross. So it seems that these Molyneux considered the moose imagery to probably belong to the 18th century, but maybe continued being made into the 19th century. But sometime in the late 19th century, this scene got kind of reimagined, not as a kind of a concern with kind of, presumably kind of hunting success and the kind of sustaining hunting success with moose, but got turned into a kind of a domestic or biographical scene with, a small family perhaps celebrating a religious or, occasion or something like that. And there were a couple of other instances as well, which involve, again, moose that have been adapted to be kind of either caribou or horses, and then again implicated in hunting scenes. So Molyneux kind of thought that maybe this kind of reflected some changes in kind of Mi'kmaq kind of life ways and kind of maybe attitudes towards animals. And he was kind of thinking that the kind of the treatment of animal bones in the early 20th century was a shadow of what was recorded in the 17th century by French chroniclers, for example. He was kind of pondering whether this treatment, this transition from, if you like, kind of imagery concerned with the chase, with the kind of relationships that people have with animals, and whether this kind of adaptation of them into kind of hunting scenes and this greater concern with biography of people kind of reflected perhaps a breakdown in relationships between Mi'kmaq and animals. I don't quite see it in the same way. I don't think that Mi'kmaq have necessarily, lost the respect, if you like, for animals, but I see it maybe as a changing kind of priorities or realities, which kind of, maybe people are becoming a little bit more pragmatic in terms of their relationships with these beings, or there's a greater emphasis on, the kind of the biographical element of making imagery as opposed to its role as a kind of as servicing, if you like, the community as a whole.
And it's always nice to hear about a moose centaur. Those are so rare on the podcast. But so I think we might be looking at a half-finished bottle of Courvoisier at that point, Ken. And did you have any more questions, Ken?
No, we got a last one here, and I guess do you have a particular depiction of rock art that is sort of like a favorite of yours, or something that you feel like is particularly evocative, or something that struck you as kind of awe-inspiring? And is it, if it's in the Maritimes or elsewhere? Like, I know you're looking at rockscapes in Neolithic Britain as well, and whether or not there are certain things that struck you that you wanted to share.
I do, actually, and it's actually in New Brunswick. It's a site called Ting Hill on the Kingston Peninsula, just above St. John, and it's a very interesting site. It's a rocky kind of outcrop on the side of a hill overlooking Kingston Creek, which was a traditional like portage route for Coig and others to kind of basically shortcut having to go down the peninsula down into the headwinds coming up the valley. And on this rocky outcrop, which I think the imagery belongs to anywhere between, say, the mid-18th and late 19th century, you've got two human figures. One of these human figures depicts a person with a very round face, with a distinctive eyes and a kind of V-shaped nose and a nice broad mouth, wearing a top hat and perhaps a shawl or something like that. And this image is fascinating because the details of the face are found in imagery at McGowan Lake, and funnily enough, in this scene of this family I just told you about.
Interesting.
So, and it's also found, to my mind, in some images of people or humans found at a rock art site near Sherbrooke in the Quebec townships. That's one of the images. The second image there is one that hasn't been recorded before, and this is what looks to be like a military style figure shown in profile, with high boots, a cloak that appears to be kind of, striding in one direction, but it's very similar to some military style figures found at Peter Point at Kejimkujik. Now, there hasn't been a lot of work done on kind of styles in post-contact rock art in the Maritimes, but it strikes me that Ting Hill these two images share stylistic similarities with with imagery found in southwest Nova Scotia and now in the Quebec townships. And to me, it evokes this kind of post-contact realities and the fluidity of movements of Mi'kmaq, Wostakóyik, Penobscot, and others who are basically moving between the St. Lawrence River Valley and the Maritimes. And it's very difficult to talk about styles when you've only just got a handful of imageries. But for me, it speaks to really some of the post-contact realities faced by Mi'kmaq and Wostakóyik. And the fact that despite settler colonialism, these imageries basically mark, they basically say, we're still here. They mark Indigenous presence. And the fact that this site, Ting Hill, is on top of a hill, overlooking the creek and overlooking the spire and the church at Kingston Settlement is also intriguing. But to my mind, it also reflects a kind of another pattern, which I see kind of that slightly differentiates the distribution of pre-contact rock art and post-contact rock art in the region. And this is that a lot of the post-contact sites aren't located directly at the water's edge. So places like Ting Hill, the site up at Kingsclear, the sites at Bedford and in Dartmouth, they're located slightly away from actually those areas which were or would have been the kind of pre-contact camping grounds, occupation areas. And so what I see this imagery, the distribution of this imagery reflecting is Mi'kmaq and Wostakóyik being kind of marginalized to the periphery of former territories. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, they are seeking to adapt their economies and to basically, you find them, Mi'kmaq, selling their wares on the edge of emerging Euro-Canadian or settlements and towns. And I think what we see of the post-contact rock art is a kind of a reflection of this kind of these new realities that Mi'kmaq and Wostakóyik are experiencing. So that is one of the major findings that I argue in my research, is that this rock art kind of really it's the Mi'kmaq and Wostakóyik side of version of history in a way, and it speaks to a history, a difficult history, but an important history to appreciate.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Bryn.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you for that. And I, just to tie that, like the continuities too, like that, the portage route is sort of a piece that was used in the pre-contact and those sorts of places. And but yeah, no, that's excellent. That's a perfect way to end things.
Absolutely. So that was Bryn Tapper from the Memorial University of Newfoundland. Thank you so much for coming on, Bryn. We appreciate you sharing your wisdom about rock art with our listeners.
Yes, thanks for coming on, Bryn.
Again, we've got some hit pieces for our listeners to check out, and at least the first one here is one that I believe is open access. I believe that the listener can just basically click it and read it, and what that is the Newfoundland and Labrador Provincial Archaeology Office Annual Review, 22nd volume. So this is the 2023 volume, and this PAO Annual Review is a really great publication that the office up there does every year. And at least to my mind, it's really kind of a model, the kind of research dissemination that we like to see happen from CRM, right? I mean, when we think about kind of the regional landscape, you've got things like the Maine Archaeology Society Bulletin and the PAO are kind of the sort of gold standard for getting CRM research out. Would you agree with that? And so my understanding is the way this works.
And to a certain degree, Archaeology of Eastern North America does.
That's a good point. Yeah, much more broad, but yeah, that's a great point. And the way this works is basically the PAO does it's not quite a just the facts kind of report, but it's close, where they take people who had permits in the previous year to give a kind of quick highlight of what they did in the previous season, and so you get their reports condensed down. This year's is really last year, so it's the 2023 report. So last season, It's got 18 articles in it, and it also highlights recent publications and theses related to Newfoundland archaeology. The listener's going to recognize some folks in there. Bill Fitzhugh, how many of these do you figure Bill Fitzhugh has written? Has he been in all of them?
I would be shocked if he and Stephen Loring are not in every single one of these.
Yeah, they're pretty close, I suspect.
Yeah.
So Bill Fitzhugh, Stephen Loring, Michael Rooney, lots of other folks you're going to see in this PAO write-up. And also just, again, just kind of congratulations to PAO for doing this every year. It's a real fundamental kind of public archaeology that I think is really commendable.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fantastic. And one of the things I think that it's an incredibly simple thing that they do is right up front, before the table of contents, they have a map of Newfoundland and Labrador, and they basically point to the general area where each of the authors' articles take place, which I think is actually just a fantastic way to show the geographic scope of archaeology work going on in a region, right? Like, I think that would be a really fascinating thing to see coming out of the Maritime provinces as well. So
yeah, absolutely right. But Ken, speaking of, a lot of this work comes from cultural resource management, which is a research interest of yours. It's also it's what you've been hired to do, isn't it? Don't you have a job that's got CRM somewhere in the title? And so part of this thing that you're doing is you I don't suppose that you're obligated to necessarily, but you do maintain a research interest in CRM and the labor market, and you're doing some work on this that we'd like to let the listener know about.
Yes, Lindsay Amundsen-Meyer, who is a faculty at University of Calgary in their Department of Archaeology and Anthropology, who was actually up until recently in a very similar position to mine, where she's sort of the CRM field school person, basically at U of C. She's got an interest in CRM industry, and Matthew Monroe, who is a recent PhD graduate from U of C, works for Stantec Consulting. We got into
University of Calgary, not California.
University of Calgary.
Listener. Yes.
Yes.
More stampede, less sunshine.
Yeah. Well, actually, tons of sunshine. Actually, there's lots of sunshine in southern Alberta. That's.
Sorry. Yeah. More stampede.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. More belt buckles.
Less surf.
We got into a conversation a while back about how we have all kind of grappled with the fact that there's very little information about the CRM industry in Canada, that we can't actually kind of point to hard numbers about how many people are in the industry, what the size of it is. And in particular, this has kind of knock-on effects for us in universities, where we are trying to develop curriculum and like teaching programs and different programs of different sorts in order to educate students in cultural resource management and get them kind of a little bit more job ready, I guess, for industry, and think about programs and courses and even sort of topics that we can be covering in university settings that better prepare students, the vast majority of our students, who will end up in the CRM industry, right? And so we kind of talked about this for a little while, and then Lindsay was kind enough to investigate how to sort of develop a survey, and so we came up with some questions. And what we have is sort of the first step in a labor market and scholarship of teaching and learning study that's going to be. And so this is essentially two separate anonymous surveys. One of them is aimed at employers. It's designed to collect labor market data. So basically, it's going to be asking about the size of your firm, maybe how many people you employed in the last year or in the last couple of years, to try to get a sense of whether we can see growth in the last 5 years in the industry. And then another one, which is aimed at anybody working in CRM, to get a sense about their preparedness for their job and their work conditions. And so we've distributed these broadly. We'll include links to each of these surveys in the show notes. But the important thing is, for the employer survey, what we want to do is capture just one person per office and per firm, so that we can actually kind of get a sense of how many companies they are. And in order to protect private interests, we're keeping things very general, and it's totally anonymized. So we won't actually know. So the key is that the employers designate one person to do this, because we don't want to get repeated data. And because this is going to be involving research, including human subjects, we've gone through a research ethics board application at the University of Calgary, and so that is confirmed.
And that's what you use. They're the ones that tell you, when you answer the question, how many volts the person on the other side is around to send through the cable that you're connected to, right? So like if you if you say, no, I think my company really likes to excavate at 15-meter intervals. And
exactly.
No, not in this province, you don't bust there.
We pull out the zap. And so the idea is...
But the safe
kind
zap,
of framed,
that's what the ethics board does.
It's framed around a couple of research questions. So what is the labor market demand for archaeologists in Canada? And is this demand exceeding supply of new students and professionals? What job satisfaction factors may be encouraging retention of professionals within the cultural resource management industry or driving them out of this industry? What skills or knowledge are required to succeed in CRM? Where are there gaps in your post-secondary education as they apply to employment in CRM? And how effective do students and professionals feel that post-secondary education is preparing them for employment in archaeology? And what we're doing is kind of piggybacking on a lot of work that's going on in the United States right now. We've referenced that Altschul and Klein article from 2022 that kind of did an overview of what the CRM industry is looking like in the States and kind of forecasting that there's going to be the shortfall. And I think we've talked about this on the show a couple of times, that anecdotally, it seems like everybody is incredibly busy and nobody has enough people to work for their companies, and that contracts are getting turned down by companies because they don't have enough people to do the work. And what we want to do out of this is maybe be able to point to, yes, these are real numbers, and here are some strategies that we can have to kind of like address these concerns.
Hey, well, that'll be very interesting, and I'm curious what you find. And so will we put in, are you sending that survey around? Are we putting it in the show notes? How's this getting disseminated? How would the listener find this?
We'll put the links in the show notes, but we are sending it around on social media right now. We've sent out email blasts. If you or somebody in your network has already received those emails, forward it to anybody you think you can capture. It's called a snowball cluster sample or something like that. It's basically snowball something. I can't remember what the specific term is, but basically
you just
the
strung
idea,
together a string of cat names. But
the idea
snowball
is that
cluster fuzzy sample.
The idea is that as you distribute it, and networks become networks of networks, and so we'll also be handing out information about this at the CAAs in a couple of weeks. And the survey, the aim is to have it open until at least the end of May, and spend the latter half of the summer kind of going through the data.
So if you're listening to this in the work truck.
Pardon me?
So if you're listening to this in the work truck, don't just take it yourself. Make sure that you're holding the other people in that work truck accountable.
Exactly. Yeah, every person on your crew should be taking the survey for the preparedness and work conditions survey, and your crew chief or your boss at your company is the one who should be doing the employer survey.
That's right, and so that's right. Help us make sure that Ken Holyoke's name is in lights in the next Advances in Archaeological Practice, reporting on the kind of crucial data. But in all seriousness, this is actually kind of important, in part because. From my point of view, it's important somewhat because we're trying to plan curriculum and plan programs. And It turns out that just going to your dean and saying, we have a strong hunch that there's a shortage of CRM archaeologists, because it turns out the art historian was in there just ahead of you saying, oh no, Mr. Dean, we can assure you that there's a dramatic shortage projected of American art historians, and it's really crucial we get 2 faculty lines. But we're going to have hard data, and we're going to show them what's up. And Ken and I are going to be, well, Ken anyway, he's going to be taking me for a ride in his brand new. What's the most CRM vehicle you can possibly think of? It'd be an F-350 with dualies and leather seats.
You know what? It was the Ford Expedition that we drove for the Greater Moncton Airport upgrade that Trevor Dow ushered us to site every day in a pretty decked out Ford Expedition that had the fold down mud runners and leather seats. All of the seats had air conditioning in the seat, which is a real treat.
Oh wow!
And a pretty bumping sound system. Day. Yeah, it was a 3-row beauty, and tinted windows and everything.
And it can double as a podcast studio. So listener, check that out. Check out the PAO annual review. We'll throw links to those in the show notes. And thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in Saskatoon if you're going to be there, and if not, we'll talk to you about Saskatoon fairly soon.
Yeah. Thank you, listener, and we'll talk to you in a fortnight, and we will see many of you in a fortnight and a day.
That's right. Talk to you soon, listener.